The neighbors were shocked when they peeked out their upstairs window. They were upset to see a tent in their neighbor's backyard. They thought someone inside was doing something wrong, so they called the police. They wanted their neighbors to get in trouble and leave the neighborhood forever. It was a quiet afternoon for the residents of Holly Springs in North Carolina. Doug Jennings was a retired police chief of the Holly Springs Police Department. Since retiring, he spent his days birdwatching and serving as the leader of their local neighborhood watch patrol. He enjoyed it. He was proud that he could still serve his community in some way. Doug and Ruth had lived in Holly Springs all their lives. They met in high school, got married, and had 2 children, who now had families of their own. Doug was well respected in the community because he worked at HSPD. When he retired, everyone in the neighborhood celebrated with a barbecue. Although Holly Springs was safe, Doug wanted his neighbors to know they could always rely on him in emergencies because of his police connections. Little did he know someone nearby needed his help urgently. He never imagined he would uncover something that would shock the whole neighborhood and make them question who lived among them. Everyone who lived on Springside Drive knew each other. Whenever Doug spotted someone leaving their home to go to work or just tending their gardens, he would wave at them politely. But there was one family that usually kept to themselves. This family lived right next door to Doug, and they had a son, Jamie, who was friendly but reserved and shy. The Hamels were from Raleigh, and they had only been in Holly Springs for a few months. On the day they moved in, Doug and Ruth took a cherry pie that Ruth had baked. When they knocked, Mrs. Hamel opened the door only slightly. It was clear to Doug that she didn't want them to see the inside of the house. Perhaps the house was messy from unpacking, but Doug happened to catch a glimpse of something inside the house, and he instantly knew that he had to keep an eye on his new neighbors. As the couple was heading back to their home, Doug looked up and spotted Jamie staring from an upstairs window. He waved at him with a friendly smile on his face. Jamie responded with a half smile, but his face was sullen. Doug decided just then and there that he was going to make it his personal mission to look out for Jamie. He asked Ruth to keep sending food over to their house. Doug could feel in his gut that something was not right with his new neighbors. One afternoon, while Doug was doing his usual rounds in the neighborhood, he spotted Jamie. He was walking down the street with shopping bags in his hands. He was looking down at his feet when he noticed Doug approaching. He didn't want to talk to him, but Doug wanted to make sure that what he sensed was just a simple mistake. Jamie refused to make eye contact. After spending 40 years in the police force, Doug had seen cases like these many times before. He was hoping that what he was seeing wasn't one of those cases and that Jamie was just another shy teenager who wanted to be left alone. But why did he insist on avoiding Doug? Once Doug reached him, he offered to help carry the groceries. Jamie appeared to be embarrassed by the offer, but he reluctantly obliged, and they walked the short distance to his house. The bags were heavy, and Doug couldn't help but take a look inside one of the bags. What he saw upset him. The bags were filled with cigarettes and alcohol. The only food was a few boxes of microwavable meals. Doug was getting upset, and this prompted him to ask Jamie if he was okay and where he had gotten the alcohol from. After all, he was only 16. Jamie shrugged and mumbled out an answer about it being something he had collected from his parents' friend, and he didn't purchase it himself. Doug believed him for the most part, but knew he needed to do some more digging. He decided the only way to really get to know these people was to invite them over for dinner. He could then check their behavior and see how they acted. "Why don't you and your parents join us for dinner tonight?" Jamie looked noticeably nervous and stood still as he contemplated what to do. By now, Doug knew that his instincts were right. "I don't think my parents will come. They're always busy, but I'll come if you'll have me." Doug saw a little light in Jamie's eyes. "Of course, you're welcome in our home any time." Doug left the alcohol-filled bag on the porch and walked off home. He wanted Ruth to make an extra special meal just for Jamie. Just as the clock struck 6, Jamie was on their porch ringing the doorbell. The Jennings were impressed by the young man's punctuality. When they opened the door to receive him, Doug couldn't believe his eyes. Jamie was dressed in his Sunday best and looked a far cry from how he had looked a few hours ago. What was going on? They ushered him in, and his face lit up when he saw how beautifully the dinner table was set up. It was like he saw everything for the first time. Doug watched closely. He needed to see the signs before he could turn into a detective again. Jamie seemed incredibly happy to be having dinner with them. Before Doug and Ruth could ask him any questions, he was hungrily wolfing down the roast chicken and potatoes. That was one of the signs that Doug had noted down. It seems like the kid had not had a decent meal in ages. He looked at Ruth, and she immediately knew what Doug was thinking. When it was dessert time, Ruth dished him a hearty bowl of peach cobbler and cream. Jamie couldn't believe that he was eating all of his favorite foods. Ruth decided to ask him a few questions. "How often does your mom cook for you, Gear?" With that, Jamie froze up, and the Jennings knew they had overstepped the mark. "I think I need to go. Thank you so much for this delicious meal." Before Ruth could say anything about packing him some leftovers, he was out the door. Doug felt like he now had enough signs for him to begin to monitor the house and watch over Jamie. Something was wrong in the Hamill house, and he was going to find out what it was. The next day, Ruth packed up some food for Jamie: chicken, potatoes, and peach cobbler. Doug planned to take it over himself. He was determined to see what was happening in Jamie's house. Something seemed wrong with how Jamie was being treated, and Doug wasn't going to ignore it. He had seen bad situations before and didn't want another child to suffer. Doug walked onto the porch of Jamie's house, noticing how rundown it looked. Mr. Hamill answered the door, looking tired and annoyed. Doug handed over the food, but Mr. Hamill seemed angry. He said Jamie wasn't home and closed the door quickly. Doug left but felt uneasy. He hadn't seen Jamie at the window. He waited for Jamie to come home from school, but he never showed up. Doug worried that Mr. Hamill lied to him. Where was Jamie? Was he safe? That night, Doug talked to Ruth about his concerns. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong and that Jamie needed their help. He stayed awake all night worrying about Jamie's safety and whether his visit had caused any problems for him. The next day, Doug was basically a zombie, but he promised Ruth he would go to Lowe's to get a new outdoor couch for their porch. He dragged his feet through the aisles trying to find the perfect couch. As he turned a corner, he spotted Jamie. Thankfully, he was okay, but Doug noticed he was buying a tent. "Going camping, son?" Doug inquired curiously. Jamie looked startled and Doug sheepishly backed away, showing him that he meant no harm. "Yes, my dad and I are going." But Doug could see that it was a lie. There was no way a guy like his dad was taking him camping. Doug said goodbye and went on his way. That night, Doug lay awake in his bed. He couldn't stop thinking about the strange encounter he had with Jamie. He got up and went to the window for some fresh air, and that's when he saw it. He was looking straight into the Hamill's backyard, and in the middle was Jamie, rolling out a sleeping bag to put in his newly acquired tent. Doug instantly woke Ruth to come and see what he was seeing. They remained quiet. They didn't want the boy to know they were watching him. Doug was angry to see a young boy wearing just a thin jacket outside in freezing weather. Determined to help, he marched to the neighbor's house early in the morning, banging on the door loudly. Other neighbors gathered to see what was happening. Jamie, the boy from next door, tried to stop Doug, urging him to go home and not interfere. But Doug couldn't ignore the boy's suffering. He broke down the door and was hit by a terrible smell. Inside, he found the Hamills passed out on couches in a messy, unkempt house. It was clear they were not fit to care for a child. Doug called the police and child services immediately. The Hamills were arrested for child abuse and neglect, but Doug soon discovered this was just the tip of the iceberg. With help from his police connections, Doug learned shocking details about Jamie's parents. Jamie's parents had a history of drug problems and debt running from the law in several Midwest cities. They were like the infamous Bonnie and Clyde, involved in crimes like robbing diners and stores. Despite seeming to stop their crimes, they focused their negative energy on Jamie, neglecting him. Neighbors reported them, but they always fled before the authorities arrived. Finally caught, they faced numerous charges including child abuse. They blamed Jamie for their arrest, showing no care for him. Watching them leave, Jamie realized he needed to move on. He endured living outside before Doug took him in, unable to tolerate his parents' neglect and fearing consequences if he spoke up. Jamie's parents punished him by withholding regular meals, devouring most of the food before he could eat. When Jamie sought a job at a local store to provide for himself, his parents intervened, claiming he was mentally ill. They warned the owner not to speak with Jamie again, prompting the authorities' involvement. Doug and his wife rescued Jamie from his troubled home, offering him a loving environment and enrolling him in school. Witnessing Doug's kindness inspired Jamie to become a police officer, aspiring to help others like himself. Reflecting on Doug's impact, Jamie was determined to honor him by serving the community. Jamie swiftly pursued his dream after high school, joining the police academy. Determined to honor his guardian, disaster struck unexpectedly. Despite his successful first year, Jamie learned of Doug's brutal attack, sensing it was more than a home invasion. Rushing home, he found Doug injured, suspecting a deliberate message. Sitting with his mom, Jamie pondered if his imprisoned parents orchestrated the attack as they vowed revenge. Their threats against him and Doug echoed ominously, leaving Jamie questioning their involvement.